I think many people are interested to know more about China. Now, the most important country in the world as on date is China and not the United States. Because China represents the aspirations of the Asian people. But let's examine how China has reached this stage. And I'm going to discuss one facet of the Chinese character which is totally different from the Indian character. Now, China in 1900, I think I'll start from that period, started a rebellion against foreign domination and they began attacking Christian missionaries and churches and burning them all over China. This is called the Boxer Rebellion, and Peking, which was the capital at that time, was under siege, and a lot of Christians were just captured, executed. The Western powers intervened in what is known as I told you, the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, and after weeks of fighting, they were able to subdue the Chinese, and the empress rather, had to eat crow. The Chinese were defeated, and they were defeated basically because of the use of troops of the British Indian Army, mainly the Punjabis and the Sikhs. Well, gentlemen, after the defeat, the dynasty, that is the ruling dynasty in China, was discredited, and 1911 there was a revolution in which the dynasty was overthrown, and the man who engineered it is Dr. Sun Yat-sen. He's the first man who brought in the Chinese Revolution. But Dr. Sen didn't last long, and whatever he wanted to do, he could achieve. And his successor became the Nationalist Party, that is the Kuomintang. And around that period, there was a young general of the Chinese army who rose up, and he's known as General Chiang Kai Shek. This man took control of the nationalists and the destiny of China. But there was a nascent communist movement in China at that time, articulated by the Chinese Communist Party, which was being supported by the Russians, who had come into power in 1917. That is, the communists had come to power in 1917 after the famous October Revolution. Gentlemen, these were the seeds which were sown for a civil war in China. China, from the year 1900 onwards, was also dominated by warlords. Now, that also is one aspect of history which you cannot forget it, because these warlords were very powerful and they controlled large chunks of territory in China and they did whatever they wanted to do. So, China was a society always in ferment. There's no peace, there's bloodshed, killing, murder, everything was going on there, and no industry worth the name. On top of it, they had made concessions to the Western powers, given the British Hong Kong, special concessions in Canton, Shanghai, and other places, and the Western powers were having a ball really. There was one factor which was bugging the Western powers, and that was Japan. Because Japan was devoid of uh, raw materials, and they wanted raw material, and the only way they could get it was from Manchuria and China. So the Japanese mounted an invasion of Manchuria. Before that, there was a battle for supremacy between three people: the warlords, the communists, and the Kuomintang. The communists were led by Mao Zedong, and the Kuomintang by General Chiang Kai Shek, and of course there were the warlords. Later on, the warlords sided with either with the communists or with the nationalists, that is the Kuomintang. Most of them joined the Kuomintang, and then commenced what is known as the Civil War. Now, this was the first phase of the Civil War, and it lasted up to 1937. And in this Civil War, there was again a lot of mayhem, killings, firing, and all that going on. And the Japanese had their own axe to grind. They had invaded Manchuria, occupied it, and set up a new regime called Manchukuo. Now, as I told you, in 1911, the Chinese dynasty had been overthrown. So the Japanese resurrected that dynasty, and the successor, that is Puyi, was made the emperor of China, that is the area which was controlled by Japan, which they called it Manchukuo. And so the dynasty got another lease of life under Japanese rule. But the emperor had no power really, nothing, and things came to such an head that, as far as I understand, even his wife was impregnated by a Japanese staff officer. He was not an independent man. But then there's nothing much he could do because he had been overthrown in China, so he needed somebody, and the Japanese were there to help him. In the meanwhile, the civil war had commenced between the Kuomintang and the Maoists, that is, the communists. Battles were raging, but then wisdom dawned on them thanks to the American intervention, and a truce was worked out between the two warring factions that we will fight our battles later. Let us first fight the Japanese. So the civil war for some time was suspended, and the Japanese were at the receiving end of the Kuomintang and the communists who united to fight them. But there was a lot of suspicion between the two, and the Americans who were supplying weapons to China at that time would not supply the weapons to the communists but only to the nationalists. And the nationalists were, of course, more powerful at that time, and they began to control more and more of China. And there's something called the Long March, almost 6,000 miles, where the Chinese Communist Party and the Mao Zedong retreated, and they were bombed and hit by the Kuomintang, but they survived, and they reached the hills of central China. It, After that, of course, the Japanese occupation was on, and the Japanese committed a lot of atrocities. Basically, the Japanese were findish. I have not understood what is the Japanese character, because one can't understand treating women in the way the Japanese did it. It's all documented in the history books. I'm going to repeat it, except let us say there were a lot of atrocities. Women were made slaves to the Chinese soldiers, and there's an excellent video available also, which you can see, wherein a Chinese sergeant and his two men come to a village house who has got two daughters, a villager, and they pray to the Chinese, please spare our daughters. He said, we'll spare them, but they have to first service us. You understand what that means. And after it was over, the Japanese still went away, but not after they shot both the girls in the legs or something like that. So, well, gentlemen, it was atrocities, and we know about the rape of Nanking, and it was a very terrible time. But at that time, the civil war was suspended. That is called the first phase of the civil war. Then came the atomic bombs over Japan, and once that happened, Japan surrendered. Emperor Hirohito, who was the architect of this war, said, bye bye, I don't want to fight. And at that time, vast areas of China were still under the occupation of the Chinese, of the Japanese. So the Japanese army began to surrender, mostly to Chiang Kai Shek, and then came Stalin's masterstroke. Stalin, who had been biding his time and honoring the peace pact with Japan, now intervened in Manchuria, and in no time the Japanese army was defeated, and he captured large amount of weapons and accepted the surrender of the Japanese army. And what Stalin did was to hand over all those weapons to Mao Zedong. So when the war ended in 1945, Mao Zedong was greatly strengthened, and then again the suspended civil war, which had been suspended in 1937 to fight the Chinese, again commenced. This is known as the second phase of the Civil War, which started in 1945 and continued till the end of 1949. The Americans tried their level best to broker a peace initially. Averell Harriman, the American representative, was in China to broker a peace between the communists and the nationalists, but it didn't work out. And ultimately, both of them were again at each other's throats. So the Americans decided that they would help only the Kuomintang, and they began to do that. And now the Rush, of course, the Mao Zedong's communists had been heavily armed with the Japanese weaponry. And earlier, Mao, who was fighting a guerrilla war, now convinced, thought it is time to start the conventional war, and they began assaulting the Kuomintang all over China. The Kuomintang, that is the nationalists, were defeated city by city, and in 4 years they began to surrender ground to the Chinese. And little by little, they lost entire China. And by the end of 1949, General Chiang Kai Shek was at his wits' end. He had been defeated resoundingly by the communists and the Mao Zedong. And what he did was he escaped to the island of Formosa with his supporters, and I think about a million Chinese also accompanied him with boats and all that. And those who were his supporters, they went to Formosa. Now, one mistake the Americans had committed in 1945, the island of Formosa had been under the occupation of the Japanese for the last 50 years, from 1900 onwards. And after Japan surrendered, they handed over Formosa to the Chinese, made it a part of China. And later on, the Americans regretted it, but then the deed had been done. And Chiang Kai shek escaped there to Formosa. The Chinese, that is the communists, didn't have the amphibious capability to mount an assault on Taiwan, so they bided their time, but they made the other intentions very clear, because at the end of 1949, Mao Zedong wanted to restore the old glory of China, and he ordered the invasion of Tibet. Now, Tibet was a semi-independent state for centuries. When China was strong, it had control over Tibet, and when China was weak, Tibet had some form of autonomy. This was sanctified by the 1913 Shimla Conference, when the British, who had occupied Lhasa under Brigadier Young Husband, brokered an agreement at the point of the gun. The Chinese didn't accept it. The Ming Dynasty at that time ruling China didn't accept it, and but there was no choice. China was weak at that time, and then of course came the revolution and all that came up, and the dynasty vanished, and a lot of things happened. Puyi became a puppet of the Japanese, and all that continued. And then, of course, China reasserted itself, occupied Tibet, thanks, of course, to the inefficiency, the lack of foresight, and the lack of strategic vision of the Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. And Nehru is an enigma. I'll talk about him a little later on this issue, not in this thing, but let us accept the fact that he had no comprehension of what is strategic initiative or strategic dominance. And he thought China is going to be his friend, while Mao Zedong was nobody's friend. Mao Zedong was out to restore the glory of China. And the fact remains that from 1900 to 1949, almost for half a century, China was in the throes of lawlessness, bloodshed, and civil war. And it's only when the Communist Party came into power in China in 1949 this thing stopped. In contrast, India had a very peaceful existence thanks to the British Raj. India developed. Well, there are two sides to a coin. I think if you remember what Niraj Chaudhary said, he said, whatever I see when I step out of my house, whether it is the tram car or the high court buildings or the schools or the soldiers marching, all are a gift of the Raj, the British Raj. But the British did not give us sovereignty. That's the point. But they gave India nationhood. India was never a nation. And Nehru should have built on that, but he didn't do it. And he frittered everything away and allowed China to have its dream of resurgence become a reality. So there's a cardinal big difference between Indian ethos and Chinese ethos. China was born in bloodshed, war, arson, killing, everything, while India had a peaceful transition to an extent, except for the partition riots, which were maybe engineered by whom. We'll talk about that later some other stage. Other than that, India was very peaceful even during the Second World War days. My grandfather used to tell me when he was very old that the British Raj was very good, bahut acha tha. There was no mehengai, no rise in prices. They controlled everything. Well, As I told you, there's two sides to a coin, one side, second side. So we now discuss that point while discussing that the ethos of the Chinese are different from that of the Indians. Chinese believed in domination, and they was a nation which was born through blood and sweat, while India got their freedom on a platter, on a plate. They didn't have to fight for it. There was no fight in the villages, and I don't think Indians really fought any time for independence at all. Even the 1857 mutiny is a big farce, basically. It was just confined to a few districts in few portions of northern India, and that's all. The whole of India was quiet as a mice. And so many Indians, like the Sikhs and others, they went and joined the British, and they took part in the assault on Delhi. It was a mutiny by a few soldiers, and even bulk of the Bengal army, the East India army, was on the side of the British. As far as the Chinese are concerned, they were under the boots of the Western powers, and they were eager to get out of it. And part of it became a reality when the Japanese occupied Shanghai and Hong Kong and other places, and they threw the Chinese and the European powers out from there. And after the end of the war, these European powers tried to get back, but they couldn't go back there. And that was the end of British influence, Western influence, French influence, German in China. China now began to readdress the historical wrongs which they felt had been done by imperialism. India did a mistake in trying to put forward the British point of view all the time on the border. China did not recognize the border as it said it's an imperialistic border. And the fact that India had accepted suzerainty of China over Tibet, obviously there was no choice but to say that Tibet is part of China and India's border is with China, and China didn't recognize the border which had been signed by the Tibetans as per the 1913 agreement. So the seeds were thrown for a conflict with India were sown. There was no choice. They had to have a fight together. And Mao Zedong, of course, won because he was the man with astute vision, a chance to make China great. We must remember that China during the Middle Ages was known as the Middle Kingdom, the center of the world. So they wanted to restore that, while the Indians at the other end, I don't know whether they want to restore anything at all. Gentlemen, the point I'm coming to is that India had a peaceful transition, didn't know what actually war is, what bloodshed is, what killing is during the 200 years of the British Raj, and rather the last 100 years under the crown. While as far as China is concerned, it was bloodshed, mayhem, fighting, everything was going on all the time, and innumerable atrocities were being committed on the Chinese women by the Japanese army, which the Chinese have not forgotten the date. Now China is resurgent, and the seeds of this are sown in the occupation of China by the Western powers and the subjugation of China. Actually, it started from 1842 and 1856 when the Opium Wars were fought, and China was defeated, and the British enforced opium trade on the Chinese. China wanted to get rid of all the remnants of imperialism, and they did it very successfully. Gentlemen, the clash with China is imminent because India is sticking to the concepts or the theory which was outlined on the border by the British. China doesn't recognize it. You've got to have a border settlement, and it cannot be on what the British had demarcated and went away. Because the portions which are facing China, like Aksai Chin and Nefa, which the Chinese are claiming now, were never part of the Indian Empire ever by an Indian king. The only time they came in the Indian control was when the British came there. And when the British went away, it was incumbent on India to police those areas, strengthen them, and do and establish your sovereignty over them. But the Indians didn't do it. They were vacant land, no man's land. Chinese went and occupied the whole thing. Gentlemen, this basic point is to tell you that China's civil war is the defining moment of world history. And China rose like the phoenix, the bird. which rose from its own ashes. China had been destroyed, but like the phoenix, it has risen up and is now a big power. And India will have to accept it. There's no choice, even the Americans, and we'll have to see what happens in the future. But definitely, you cannot ignore China. I will close now, gentlemen, and say goodbye. Please subscribe to my channel, share it with your friends, and I will say Jai Hind, glory to India. I will close now. Do come back and watch my video again. And lastly, I will repeat that China is a resurgent power and you'll have to deal with it come what may. Thank you.